So what we're going to do here is what happened the second time round, which is give you a chance to ask some questions, and perhaps in the course of that question, add a tidbit or two about what the conversation was at your table. But rather than sort of going through this round by round presentation, I'm sorry, Terry. Let's see what kind of questions there are out there about these issues.
We have a question here. Starla?
Okay.
All right.
And
So,
please tell us who you are.
Starla Officer, co-director of the new University Assisted Community School Center at IUPUI. All right.
All right.
And parents.
Starla.
And parents. And for the purposes
See, when you
of this
announce
conversation,
your name, all of a sudden,
parent.
now we have to applaud for everybody, right?
Alrighty, so we had two questions, one of which was, how can we use data not for the sake of just knowing the numbers, but to make real improvements in the schools?
Okay. Who wants to let's get a couple of responses. Monica, Kathy's ready, and then Monica.
Well, one of the things, and this is just an example, and I didn't really go into it too much. I said I borrowed from Chicago. We did. We talked about, we have performance management sessions with our principals and with our schools, where we actually engage in a conversation around the data, because really, you're right, you can have tons of data, but unless you really engage in meaningful dialogue and dig deeper into the data and begin to ask questions. So our performance management sessions go from 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 5:30. And our principals were like, holy cow, how are we gonna sit there for 5 hours? But I'll tell you, it's the fastest 5 hours you could ever imagine, because it's not a surface conversation. It really is a deep conversation. There's also data teams inside of the schools that really bring that data to the table during their school-wide planning, during their PL 221 planning, and that data is a part of the conversation too. So I think data is important, but it's not going to go anywhere unless you have conversation around it.
Monica?
I think you also have to establish what is it that you want to do with the data, and why are you collecting it, and I would say that in many instances it may also mean that you have to look at policy. For example, if we're going to look at attendance policies, perhaps we need to look at chronic absenteeism and then dig deeper into the complexity of that particular issue, which means that we're looking now at family engagement, we're looking at social workers, so it has to be multidisciplinary in some cases. So that has to have a purpose. It's just, sometimes we do it to chase the dollars, and I caution us doing that.
Anyone else? Oh, okay. Please.
I'm Bill Glick, and I'm Executive Director of the Indiana Juvenile Justice Task Force, Incorporated. And I also currently serve on the Indiana Commission on Childhood Poverty as the co-chair for the Education Committee. My question is really, is there work done on a gender basis or gender bias in family engagement? And one of the things I note, having had a 30-some-odd-year career in social services, is that overwhelmingly events like this, the audience is female, and I'm talking about a career that ranges from my experience in daycare all the way up through what I currently do. So has any research been done in differences between dad, mom, partner engagement in that regard? Because when I've done, just sitting here doing the introspection exercise, I continue to picture moms whenever you all have talked about family engagement. And I'm wondering what has been done, if anything, about...
So before we ask that question, let me just ask the audience. How many people in the room had the same picture that Bill just described as they've listened to all of this? How many people saw moms and not dads? Oh, you're not telling the truth. Maybe you are. Okay. Anybody, is there research on this? Ann, you could join us if do you know anything about this? I don't know if our panel does first.
I think Ann would be the best. I don't know of any studies. With the help of Indiana Youth Institute, we've done 2 dads summits for the last 2 years, bringing, thanks Angela, bringing fathers together across the state, but primarily from Indianapolis. And we asked Indiana Youth Institute to partner with us on a research brief, and we said, hey, share with us all the best data that you have on fathers. And they told me in the beginning, there isn't any. And Stephanie, you told me that, did you not? And I said, oh, no, surely there has to be. But it is, and Dr. Murtada, I said, we said the same thing, asking you, and there is what we found out is there is a huge need to collect the data. But we do, I think what we do see is that schools, and I think oftentimes they will be very honest in saying we know that we need to reach out to our fathers in a better way, because we tend to structure all of our outreach programs to moms. And then if you're a non-custodial father, that it's very, very difficult. So anyway, I just wanted to say you were right.
There's
right,
a lot
Stephanie.
of research on, there's a great deal of research on fathers. There's lots of national studies on fathers. The questions are, what kinds of information do we want about parent engagement and father's engagement? Mm-hmm. And so we haven't been very targeted in the kinds of questions that we want to ask. If the questions have to do with, for example, what is the role of the father in terms of attending certain kinds of meetings or supporting the school with having children dressed and ready to go to school, that's a different set of questions. Is the parent in the home, or is the father incarcerated? That's a different set of questions. And so there's lots of fatherhood data, lots of it around the country. But whether or not we use it as it's tied to family community engagement is another issue.
Mm-hmm. I wondered also, Kala, how many, when you look at the role of the family coordinator in schools, and to your point, I wonder if they aren't overwhelmingly female as well. And how are we even looking at how we're approaching that work when we're hiring people to act in the role of a family coordinator?
I'm going to ask Maria Wright to talk about the PTA gentleman who came to the Indiana PTA last semester and talked. He's out of Texas, and I know he's done some research. Can you give his name? I'm sorry, I can't think of it.
His name was Michael Hall, and he was from Texas. And the wonderful thing that I took away from that was, if anything that we do for our children, dads are going to be there. You don't have to really come up with all these elaborate new programs, but let a dad know that this is going to benefit his child, and he will be there. Now, he had some kind of neat things, like instead of little flowers and things, that you might use duct tape, for a name tag. He had some fun things that would engage a dad. But let's just be real. Let's say to our dads, this will benefit your child and help you be a better father, and they'll be there.
Thank you.
Michael Hall from Texas.
I think it's an excellent question, but I think it also goes back to how we are defining culture. And while we oftentimes narrow it down to race or ethnicity, we also have to understand the role of the parents and what parents expect from their child as well. And so while I can say that in the Latino community and very traditional communities, it may be the father that's the decision maker, and while the mother may give approval for everything, it's the father that's going to make the ultimate decision. And so until we understand the culture from those different perspectives, beyond looking at the tacos and the Spanish and all that, to understand what roles people play and what the values, norms, and behaviors are within each of those families, I think it's true for every, as we find at GW, our Appalachian community, come to us with very distinct ideas about education, and yet we try to focus our own ideas to assimilate them into something that is totally culturally incongruent to their beliefs.
Well, Monica, I'd like to follow up on that. In that particular community, though, we have a lot of male parental engagement, because something like 30% of the families are headed by single male households.
I have a question. As I've been listening to the panelists today, it came to me during your discussion that one of the kind of audiences that we were missing was the private funders. And in my experience in this field of work, the private funders play a huge role in providing the resources for this work because funding, we know, is limited with the schools. And so as we think about the use of data, it seems like there may be an opportunity here to engage the private funder community, external resources, to see if there are ways to modify their grant-making process, to influence the types of data that they're asking of organizations and schools to collect, and how we use data. And at our group, we have a private funder there, so we had a really interesting conversation around that. But to the panel, I wonder, similarly, what recommendations would you have, or conversations that maybe you've already had with private funders about the data that they're asking of organizations and schools as they are investing in this work?
Any thoughts about private funders in this regard?
Well, I think they need to be at the table and part of the conversation in terms of making sure that it doesn't become a hodgepodge of a bunch of data that's coming from lots of different places. So if they're part of the conversation and part of the collaboration, hopefully you have an evaluation committee or an evaluation team that's making some decisions about what those indicators and what kind of data you're going to collect. You know, one of the things we're exploring right now, we're not there yet, I'd be interested in hearing from the rest of the group, is we have a data warehouse, and it's very, very large. And we're actually looking at this whole issue of family, school, and community partnerships in our third year of implementation. And we're having a lot of conversations with our community partners about what data needs to be in the data warehouse, because what data do they want access to? Because school districts are rich in data. And so if we do it right, we'll be able to mine data out for them so they don't have to do layer on trying to get a different set of data. So I think involving community partners in that conversation. I'd also like to involve state folks and federal folks around. As a superintendent, you'll get this one. We are asked to do surveys in our schools almost every day by community organizations, by state folks. It takes away from student learning. So we need people to get together and decide what kinds of data collectively they need so that we're not inundating schools with those requests that take away from student learning.
Well, let me ask, Howler came up to me at the break and said there's a distinction here that needs to be made between measures, measurement, metrics, and collecting data. And Howler, maybe you should speak to that because you raised it and it's clearly been on your mind. But I do think it is an important thing as I think about the kind of data that Kathy has in her warehouse as distinguished from the kind of information that Joann might be collecting on a student-led survey of other students or of parents. Would you comment on that, please?
And you just said it. I mean, the kinds of information that we frequently collect are the things that are quantitative. And yet we can have deeper understanding with qualitative data that allows us to understand further what's going on with different cultural groups, what's understood when we pay attention to a parent that has no job and really wants you to understand why they are involved or not involved, all these kinds of things that lend themselves to further exploration. So when we have data collected, it might be measuring certain kinds of indicators, but does it really help us to understand what the issues and concerns are? And so that we don't overgeneralize. Right. And that's what I find happening so often. We overgeneralize, and then we say, these are the solutions that we could really get to, and then we fail to recognize that Appalachian parents, fathers, might bring a very different concern than would parents who might be African American, low-income white, and being able to use that complexity to understand what the conditions are to support family community engagement.
So if we are if I understand you correctly, if we are talking about an issue like early chronic absence, or an issue like even tardiness, or any data point, the question that some people ask is, so what's the story behind the data? What's really going on here when Terry tells us, as he did, that 75% of the students from high-income families?
Well, over 90% of high-income families graduate.
Right. So what's the story behind that data? Why is it that such a high number of children are chronically absent with their young? That is where it seems to me the cultural perspectives come into play, the challenges that families face, and that we need to hear from those diverse audiences. It might be that other panelists would like to add their voices to this conversation.
We've
Monica?
been trying to include ethnographic research as part of our mix so that we are not simply doing quantitative work, but focus groups with parents, broader community, even youth, to just elicit those kinds of questions as they inform either our programs or some other broader issue of college access is a big one for us, and attitudes and all of that kind of thing. So we're trying to capture that, and some of the grants that we've had only wanted originally the quantitative data, and now they're really asking us more for a broader, more localized kind of picture, and we're beginning to really include more of the ethnographic data that we're collecting. And we're using both our director of evaluation and then courses at Penn. So we're training our students in ethnographic research, and then they're the researchers working in the community. So it's a very cost-effective way of trying to capture that ethnographic data.
And I guess my point, though, Kala, is I agree with you, and I agree with Joann. I'm saying, when I think about the community school strategy, I think about how all these community partners come together and make some decisions about how to do that together. Because otherwise, if this group decides they want to collect the same qualitative data and this group decides the same thing, we're overwhelming our families. So I agree with you 100%. I just think, how do we create an infrastructure where folks are at the table making those decisions as part of an evaluation process?
There's an additional point to that, and I won't belabor it, and I think we would all agree that we've got to do that. We've got to make it so that families and community partners have their needs met.
That's right.
Out of this. And part of doing that is to recognize that when we're disaggregating the data, we're cutting it and slicing it in ways that may not actually benefit our community stakeholders and the families themselves. And so collecting of data alone isn't enough, and having specific measurements are not enough. We have to also pay attention to the shared ways that we're going to cut and slice data. Absolutely. And that becomes almost an ethical issue that we have to question as well.
And of course, the third step, if this is done well in a school context, to come back to the first question, is what's the story on chronic absence? Do we know the data, i.e. the measure? What is going on behind this? Why is this happening, right? Is it all because the school secretary is so grumpy that when a parent has a problem, they just don't come in the door? Or what are the other factors? That's the story behind the data. And then, my goodness, what are we going to do about Terry Spradlin's absolutely stunning statistics? Let's see.
Could I just add one more thing on the school
Please.
survey and the issue Kathy raised? And our schools feel the same way, that they're just bombarded with surveys. And last spring, we were being faced with a survey that our evaluation team needed to do for grant-related and other formative work we were doing. The College Board was planning another survey at the high school around their materials and other things, and there was a third one that was coming. So we worked with all three parties to develop one instrument, and each one could have certain questions that they particularly needed in that instrument. Our evaluation team made the survey scannable, which we scanned in our office, could send out the data then to each one of the other parties that was cooperating in this effort. But then the school only had to be responsible for one survey. Our community school staff helped with that. The high school students helped with getting the surveys done in various periods during the school day, lunchtimes and everything. But it was one of the first times that we, my God, they can't do that many surveys. And we all were looking at the same, many of us were looking at the same kind of questions and similar, but we could really come together as a team to put an instrument together.
Marty, we have a comment.
Please.
So our table, we went a little bit off the assignment. We did our assignment, but then we moved on to this question that Marty had posed to the panel about what are some plausible measures of family engagement. And so we wanted to add a couple of thoughts to that. So at our table, we had Sue Reynolds from the Indiana Student Achievement Institute, and she said that in their work, they are getting at parenting practices that support a college-going culture, and that they would love the help of evaluators, but they're really looking at specific practices like parents, whether parents have made sure that their kids have, are they having conversations? It's really about, are they having conversations about things like homework completion, about the importance of taking algebra in the 8th grade? Are parents talking with students, their kids, about the importance of staying on a college track, of taking AP courses? And my mind had been going to the same place about parenting practices that we know are effective. And I think that some of them are listed in the Robin Jarrett article that I included in your packet, where Robin Jarrett's research suggests that parenting practices that fall into these 3 categories are effective, particularly in high-risk communities. She talks about youth monitoring, which is about homework, right? In-home learning and resource seeking, making sure that your child has a library card, making sure that you're using the community as an educational resource. I think that evaluators could help us figure out how to actually measure changes in these parenting practices that we know are effective. So we wanted to kind of put those ideas out there. And the other thing that we talked about was, how do you get at that information? And we think that there may be some ways to do interviews with parents that would have a secondary benefit of really doing that relationship building and that trust building. So we don't think it only has to be done through surveys.
You bring a very good point here. I think that when we think of evaluation or research, it always has to be evidence-based or scientifically based. When we could sit around here and evaluate just from the discussions that we had, it doesn't have to be what some people think is scientific. It reminds me of a workshop that we did when I was working in the community. We brought the African American and Latino parents together to discuss what they thought were the issues within their homes, and specifically related to adolescent youth. And the wonderful thing about it is that it was a 5-hour discussion. And initially, the parents could not, in some cases, communicate with each other, but we did have translators. By the end of the day, they were sitting together based on the issues that they had in their own homes. And so having opportunities where people can discuss and bring forward their ideas in a place that's safe and conducive to having those safe conversations, I think, is important.
So I think we're kind of closing down here. We're 15 or 20 minutes maybe. What I thought we would do is ask Ann to come back up and perhaps put, since she's been through the whole day with you, put a little summary on some of the key points that she heard that might be part of an action agenda that would emerge from this conference. Obviously, you've got a lot of data at your tables that'll be processed, but we wanted to leave you with a few things that we think are important. We'll let Ann do that. I'll have a word, and then we'll turn it back to Jackie. Thanks, Ann.
Ann, before you go, could we have a comment from up here?
Sure. This morning we heard about the importance of social capital and sort of different dimensions of social capital development as part of the engagement conversation. And the thought I was having during this last panel was that certainly what we measure also legitimizes how we define engagement, and I think we've all been talking about that. But one thing I haven't heard much about today is the notion of parent organizing and community organizing as a form of community school engagement, and one that we know, there's several reports out of the Annenburgh Institute that positively impact school practices and outcomes. And I worry about getting so far down a road about how we measure engagement that is still very school-serving community. There's the power, this notion of empowerment is a political project. And are we really enabling parents by communicating digestible data points that really don't inform necessarily, or may not, depending on educators and communities, leaders, educational leaders, may not necessarily enable targeted organizing toward supporting the capacity not just of parents and families, but of schools.
So glad you brought that up.
How many of you think you have a pretty good idea what community organizing is? It has everything to do with power, right? And addressing unequal power relationships between people who occupy public office or do public, service work, and the families who live in low-income communities who are often at the short end of the stick. And if we look at a full spectrum of family and community engagement, we've just been talking about one end of the spectrum. We've been talking about the often troubled, fraught relationships between families and schools, particularly parents and teachers, but then widening that circle a bit to community organizations and how they can all kind of work together on behalf of children. But when you have communities that have been poor for generations and very low quality, if any, public services to communities, including schools, but also public safety, hazards. Low-income communities tend to be places where toxic waste dumps get located and so on. You're talking about an entirely different form of family and community engagement that needs to happen through community organizing, and the intention there is to build power in the low-income communities to use what we call the tools of democracy, that is, the right to free speech, to assemble, to petition, to demonstrate, and so on, to get what's needed when it has been denied over a long period of time. And often that is what's required when the power imbalance has been so great for so long. These are what, lopsided relationships between people who are, after all, members of our community, people who work in our communities, often pay taxes and so on, and should be getting good services and aren't. So if we think about it from that point of view, we should expand our horizon. I mean, a lot of what I heard today were the hot button issues of the day. Choice, teacher evaluation. These are things that have come up because there's a certain theory of change out there that lays blame in certain places for what's gone wrong in our schools. Teachers' unions are often culprits that have been singled out as obstacles to change, and poor quality teachers and tenured positions and new evaluation systems needing to be done. And that's kind of an off with their heads approach to school reform that I think is counterproductive, because it overlooks what we were just talking about in terms of community organizing, with very uneven distribution of resources that underlie the problems that we're confronting. And we've now come to the point in our country where we are saying publicly across the political spectrum that we want all children to be able to achieve, and that we should start expecting that. And we're collecting data about that, and we're disaggregating the data by outcomes by different groups. And for the first time in our history, holding people accountable when certain groups of children are not making, whatever you call it, adequate yearly progress, or not achieving at a proficient level. And we're grading schools, aren't we? A, B, C, D, and F. I'm glad to hear that only 6% of the schools in Indiana have been, singled out as F schools. I don't know what the criteria are for that, but we are really beginning to look at what we're doing. When I first came into my career, such as you might call it, when I was, in my late 20s, I was in the New Jersey Department of Education working for a progressive commissioner who, among the things that he did, was demand that we have a statewide test. Back in the 1970s, very few states had a statewide test where you could compare not only school to school, but district to district results. The National Assessment of Educational Progress was deliberately given to too small a sample nationally to be able to compare one state to the next. The College Board did not issue state-by-state averages for SAT scores, and the ACT testing program didn't do it either. It was like a conspiracy of silence. We didn't ask, and people in schools that served low-income communities could easily get away with saying, we're a perfectly good school, it's just who goes here is the problem. Mm-hmm. And we're moving away from that, and I think we can give ourselves some credit. But boy, we're still wrestling with all of the implications, and another word that came up today a lot, unintended consequences of all of this that we're trying to do. And we have different competing theories of change. We need vouchers, we need choice. Public schools need to have competition or they won't shape up, to the feeling that what we need is more investment in the quality of our existing public schools so that they can do a better job and get the professional development they need to turn around. So we still aren't absolutely sure what conditions need to be in place for schools to turn around, but we do know from that Chicago study that we've all been talking about all day long what the 5 essential ingredients are that need to be there. How we get them, we're not so sure. But we're working toward it. And it's conversations like these, deep, rich conversations in our communities at the state level, but also I encourage you, go back and have these conversations at your local level. Bring people together who don't ordinarily get a chance to sit at the same table. Include parents, not just the usual suspects, and start talking about what is meaningful to us. What do we want to happen in our schools? What do families and community members feel needs to happen? Often we don't ask our students or our families what they think is needed. Instead, we look at data. We collect all sorts of data, and we have tons of it, and we look at it, but we don't dig deeper. We don't say, well, why are we seeing this? Why is the Latino dropout rate so high? Maybe we need to ask our students and our families that question. What do they think is behind this? Because those parents in Oklahoma, they said the ELL program at the school isn't working. So the school put in core courses that were sheltered ELL classes for 9th and 10th graders, and they had somebody there to translate English to Spanish. And that made a huge difference. They also have an ELL graduation coach that's working with students and families. 4 times a year, they're bringing families in and doing college fairs and information about what needs to happen. And so that is in direct response to what families said. It wasn't some, Latino Institute from Washington or even from the state level that came in and said, the prescription for turning you around is this. They learned about it from their own community. And what's even more remarkable is after they had those community conversations, they actually did what the families recommend. How many times do we have meetings like this and we all think, boy, that was great, so interesting, boom, back to our silos and doing the same old stuff. So that's the great advantage of having these conversations that cross different disciplines. So we have people from the state level, the local level, we have people from early childhood, we have people from the foundation world, and I encourage us just to keep this conversation going. One expression that came up this morning that I wrote down that I liked very much was we have to think about respect, resilience, and relationships. We can't forget the affective side. We do a lot of hard data collection and crunching, but we can't ever forget that really what this is all about is relationships.
Thank you, Ann. Just a couple of footnotes is all I can do to Ann's quite eloquent comments. It seems to me we've heard sort of two streams of conversation here. One is this business about, getting the right looking at good metrics, trying to understand the story behind the metric, digging deeper by listening to families, by listening to parents, by listening to community, and finding ways to act together on what they say. There's a whole rubric around this, by the way, that's called results-based planning that you can go find on the web. But it sort of makes sense, right? So we've got to implement that. At the same time, I hope you won't forget that the state needs a good policy framework around these issues. And its absence means that it can be absent in what was a fairly vague response about how does family and community engagement show up in the school improvement framework of the state. We need to be advocating for a clearer framework. We need to make sure that the teachers who are begging, if I remember our PTA friend, whose name I can't remember, I apologize, D. Jones, what she said, they want more and they say, well, we're going to get it. Well, 25 years ago, Heather Weiss told us that that's the only thing a budding teacher gets. One class on how to conduct a parent-teacher conference? My goodness. When we know that a mother's education is the most important factor in their kid's success, we should be doing more with these folks. It means deepening that work and having stronger standards. And we've got our IU and UI and IUPUI people in the room, and I got it, right? Yeah. They can be leading this. And they should be able to tell us, what are they doing? I remember telling the dean of outreach at Columbia Teachers College one year, I'll know you're serious about parent engagement in your professional curriculum when parents are on your adjunct faculty. Not just Ann Henderson, but the parents who know what it's like and have spoken up. So we need to both do this, to deal with this relational dimension, but we also need to get a better set of policies and struggle harder with this question of what are the right metrics and what are the questions we should keep asking about connectedness, about the availability of social capital to young people, about how parents feel about whether they're respected in their schools. We can, like everything in life, you have to do both. You just can't say this is it. We've got to figure out a way through this very complex thicket of educating our poor kids. It's been fun to be here, even though I was late, and I'm going to give it back to Jackie.
Wow, you're tall, Marty. A couple things before we leave today, because we have, I agree with both of you, we have had brilliant, rich, deep discussions all day, and so my dream and the dream of the board members and Jim and Starla to really bring together 100 leaders across the state and really flesh out what we really want to have happen for family, school, and community engagement has happened, and so I'm so thrilled to have had these wonderful discussions. I have a lot of people to thank. But what I want to make sure that before we leave, if you would do me a favor, and so that we kind of complete the reflection process today that I used to use in my first work around with service learning was the beginning of my career for about 15, 20 years, and the what, the so what, and now what. And so before we leave today, and before I get a chance to thank all the wonderful people today, I'd really love for you to pull out of your packets the last thing in your, there's two last documents in your folder. One is a very short evaluation. If you don't have, we'd love for you to complete that. But I think more importantly is the now what. There's a document that's, I'm asking for you to really think about what would one or two actions be from your realm of influence, because we have a wonderful multidisciplinary group here. And if you would be willing to, please share one or two things that you personally would be willing to do out of today's discussion to bring to action that would continue to help us prioritize what we need to do in our state, because we've talked about so many things. So I know that afterwards we'll debrief this with those of you who have helped us put the day together and really come out with, we'll give you back all the recommendations, by the way, and we'll document all of those. But if we don't prioritize 3 or 4 that rise to the top, I think that will be very frustrating. So I do think that we want to see what those top 4 or 5 things are, or 3 to 5 things. But if you personally would be willing to share your commitment of 1 or 2 things that you could do in the next year to further family and school and community engagement, that would be very helpful. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to look at that document, and then if Starla and Jim could come forward, we would like to, we have some thank yous before you leave. Yeah. 5 is high. I was on there. Speaking of data, right?
All right, so feel free to finish that once we conclude formally. But again, my name is Starla Officer, and I'm the co-director with Jim of the new Center for University Assisted Community Schools at IUPUI. And I just want to draw your attention really quickly to the other resources that are in your folder, especially the research briefs that summarize a few key research findings related to family, school, community engagement. So check out your folder. Vanna over here is showing you the research briefs. And then again, on behalf of our center as well as the Indiana Partnership Center, we'd like to thank our sponsors once again for supporting this event, and thank each one of you for choosing to spend your time today engaging in these important conversations. And then I'm going to turn it to Jim for some specific thank yous.
Okay, specifically, we would also like to thank the board members from the Indiana Partnership Center and the board members who attended. Addie, if you'd stand up or hold up your hand, Caller Matata, Brian Reed, and Mary Ann Sullivan, and myself. So thank you very much. And as a final thank you, we would like all of the staff members from the Indiana Partnership Center to please come forward so that you can be recognized, because they are really the people who put this all together and spent hours and hours and hours making sure that it happened. I guess they didn't hear me. Oh, there they are. Thank you very much. Jackie, do you have any final comments? Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists, our lone panelist left here. Yeah.
She's taking data.
I can't tell you how many hours the staff has spent, and I just feel like they did a brilliant job in organizing today. So I'll start from the back here. Lindsay Doherty is our intern. Evelyn Garcia, our communications manager. Stacy Mathis, our operations manager. Rena Dirksen, and I'm sure, is there anybody in here who has not heard from Stacy or Rena in the last 2 months? Angela Short, our director of college and careers, and Latasha Malone, our training director. So thank you so much. Awesome job. And of course, Marty and Ann, and our New York Jane Quinn, and Joann. Where's Joann? Who came from different states to join us today. Really, really wonderful to have you all here. So thanks again, everybody. Have safe trips home.